It's 1073, 7 years after the Norman conquest of England, and a collection of nuns are hand-stitching 10 pigmented threads into scenes of battle. They toil away at the request of Bishop Odo, half-brother to William, conquering King of England. Odo has commissioned this piece to hang in his brand new cathedral in Bayeux, which will eventually give the embroidery its name, the Bayeux Tapestry. But there's something wrong. Not only is this object not a tapestry, it's an embroidery, but there's also an issue with its content. Bishop Odo has requested a cameo. It's 1973, 900 years on, and Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson are looking for a third option for a class to add to their brand new fantasy game. They have a fighting man, a magic user, but they want to find some sort of a middle ground. A character capable of some magic, healing, communing with the setting's gods, while also being tough and ready to enter the fray. The Cleric is born. What has happened in these 900 years for Bishop Odo's self-insertion into a French wall hanging to be relevant to two friends in a basement in Wisconsin, and thus the entire modern fantasy landscape? Well, surprisingly little. Directly. To answer this question properly, we need to look at the legacy of the cleric, how it has proliferated through fantasy. Because fantasy clerics have a strange and often very specific aesthetic. They generally either wear white robes, are styled as Templars, or as Franciscan friars. Oftentimes they have powers of light and of healing. They wear armour, and often wield holy scripture alongside maces in battle. They also have a significant distaste and opposition towards undead. From World of Warcraft's priest class to Dark Souls' cleric, a lot of post-D&D fantasy has this exact model of character, class and concept design. And generally this works very well, is coherent as a class fantasy. Except, for me, for one small detail. Why in the name of all that is holy would this character choose to use a mace? The long-stated, long-accepted theory for the legitimate weaponry used by men of the cloth is that, of course, priests and clerics would use blunt-edged or bludgeoning weapons to avoid drawing blood, as that would be a violation of their sacred oaths. The trouble is, historically, this is nonsense. Nowhere in Christian doctrine is there a prohibition on drawing the blood of an enemy. And let's be very clear, these fantasy clerics and priests are almost always based on Christian clergy, from aesthetics to costuming to symbology. It's all Bishop Odo's fault. He just had to instruct these embroidering nuns to conjure up his likeness wielding a club. Heck, above his depiction, the letters read, Hic Odo Episcopus baculu tenens confortat pueros. Or, here, Bishop Odo, holding his club, supports the lads. The bishop is shown at the battle with a bludgeoning weapon as his weapon of choice. Historians have speculated that it is possible that Bishop Odo had a personal vow which forbade him from carrying a sword in battle, or perhaps that he was in a non-combative role, or perhaps that this wooden-looking cudgel thing is actually a reference to the bishop's crozier or the shepherd's crook, essentially a reference to the bishop's role in leading their flock. But either way, this image of a clergy wielding a bludgeoning weapon on the battlefield had percolated for 900 years through popular culture, by the time it entered into some history enthusiasts' wargame that would eventually become Dungeons and Dragons. To be very clear, priests, monks, bishops, and even a pope have been seen on the battlefields throughout history, wielding all manner of weapons, and none. The only clergy we would reasonably expect to see on a battlefield wielding some sort of blunt bludgeoning weapon, very much a club, would be those who have taken a vow of poverty, because a tree branch or furniture leg is possibly the cheapest thing you can get your hands on. To be clear, this historical misunderstanding largely does come from, specifically, the Bayeux Tapestry, embroidery, wall hanging, whatever we want to call it. It comes from this because there are very, very few other records of clergy even deigning to wield bludgeoning weapons at all. The relative ubiquity of certain types of armaments on battlefields throughout history means that the mace is not ever the most common weapon you would ever see, nor indeed is the club, unless we're going all the way back to when we weren't forging any metals. The trouble is, it's mostly this one example, this one tapestry embroidery, I know, that makes its way into the aesthetic sensibilities with which we detail our clerics now. Essentially, the mace is just a fancier, posher, and perhaps more respectable version of the club originally, all based on something that isn't really historically true. And yet, despite all this, the vast majority of D&D styled clerics wield the mace. But why am I so incensed with this? After all, many of these games do justify the use of blunt weapons by clerical figures, saying the bones of undead skeletons are vulnerable to being broken by blunt force trauma, while arrows may just pass by a ribcage and so on. Now, this makes an awful lot of sense until you think of what else is anathema to nearly every undead creature in almost every fantasy setting that has clerics or priests. Holy magic, which is almost always depicted, by the way, as radiating from the cleric, or in beams of light. Heck, in D&D specifically, all clerics from the 1974 original edition onwards have had the ability to turn or destroy undead as part of their class features. Turning undead causes them to run away from the cleric. So having your primary weapon be a mace, when all of your enemies are likely to be running away from you if you're hunting these specific undead, seems counterintuitive. Add to that the notion that the cleric, priest, or this holy man archetype is almost always linked with healing and supporting allies as well, much like Odo supporting the lads at Hastings. And this notion of clerics being close-quarter combatants up in the thick of it, smashing apart undead, starts to make even less sense. Let me be clear, I'm not against the notion of a cleric or priest carrying a cudgel or club or staff just in case they get ambushed and are forced to fight in close quarters. In fantasy worlds that can and will happen. But the best at breaking bones or can't draw blood explanations just don't cut it. Because as anyone who's ever been beamed by a heavy object will tell you, the drawing of blood is very much on the table. So Tom, you've spent all this time ruining everyone's fun. But what's the alternative? A weapon that can deal massive bludgeoning damage to both zombies and skeletons, breaking their animated bones to destroy them. A weapon that isn't edged or pointed, just in case we're going with the explanation of this vow of not drawing blood, which kind of doesn't make any sense anyway, just in case you've got a god who's scared of cutting people. And one that can be used at range, keeping the cleric safe from harm and available to support their team with healing or magic, while also allowing them to hunt fleeing undead without chasing them down, while remaining cheap and ubiquitous enough that even those who've taken vows of poverty can still use them, and simple enough that lay priests can be trained in its use. Now those are a lot of stipulations. But such a weapon as I just described exists, and as an added bonus was used throughout history, especially against less well-armoured foes, which most undead in most settings very much count as. The humble sling. Now, I disagree with D&D's assertion that a sling is a simple weapon, but I also wouldn't necessarily categorise it as a martial weapon either. They're complex but learnable even outside of military contexts. A favourite of shepherds and herdsmen alike, slings were used throughout the ancient world, and well into the 16th century too, in certain arenas of war, largely being replaced only at the advent of the age of the firearm. Various Roman sources describe the brutality of sling pellets in warfare, even through leather armour, and sling bullets were known to break bones. causing internal injury and death from just a single impact. Furthermore, while a mace or club is going to be made of the same stuff each time you swing it, sling bullets can be swapped out or modified for specific purposes. More classic stones could give way to lead bullets for tougher foes, or silver bullets, or bullets dipped in holy water for were creatures and the like. But surely just knocking someone's lights out with a mace or club is going to cause less bloodshed than firing essentially a 100-km/h bullet at them. Well, here I quote Vegetius, Roman military expert. "Stones kill without mangling the body, and the contusion is mortal without loss of blood." In reality, the sling is a remarkably effective weapon in the hands of a trained user, easily capable of breaking bones and indeed outranging most undead, including the skeletons that are so often depicted as having short bows on them. The sling can definitely outrange some bows, unless we're getting into stationary, heavy war bows. And the sling is also more of a weapon of the people than the bow is, because they require far more complex construction methods and maintenance as well. For a cleric, or a priest who is in most cases expected to be a trustworthy, non-threatening figure to represent their deity, wandering through town with a heavy sceptre of gilded iron, capable of bludgeoning anyone to death, is kind of the opposite of that vibe. And seeing representatives of certain faiths carrying weapons at all may be deeply troublesome for the lay people. Carrying a leather strap, maybe even wrapped around your arm, and some stones in a pouch, though, equally effective, far less suspicious or threatening, and much, much easier to hide. And now for a few ways of making the clerics who use the sling more interesting, fun, and engaging for your fantasy worlds, should you choose to adopt this notion. Firstly, sling stones and bullets are likely to be part of worship, much in the same way that these bullets were inscribed with all sorts of curses, fortunes, and pithy little remarks throughout ancient times, catch being among my most favourite from Roman lead sling bullets. It's entirely possible that scripture or holy symbols would be carved into stones as well, or that certain faiths would have a codified practice of carving or forging or casting your own pellets yourself as part of a devotional practice which links the act of creation and the act of defending yourself or destroying undead or destroying your enemies as part of a holy practice. In addition to making preparation for warfare a devotional practice, the sling, unlike some melee weapons, allows for a bit of time between each attack, and the whirling wind-up of a sling seems like the perfect time for a rhythmic devotional short chant or hymn. Imagine a force of individuals on the other side of a battlefield who are singing and chanting in unison so that they can perfectly time the releases of their sling bullets so they cascade across the battlefield in a line towards you. Perhaps they're even using the songs of their gods to imbue these sling pellets with holy magic as well. Even more fun, as we discussed earlier, most priests or clerics in this aesthetic vein tend to use light magic as well. A bullet glowing with divine light sent down a corridor for scouting, or these glowing pellets sent en masse towards an enemy encampment. A wall of light bearing down upon them and tearing through their defences. There's so much drama, so much greater cinematic potential, and crucially, so much more practical sense in using a small strap of leather and some ammunition than a decorated or not gigantic mace, a heavy object, to bludgeon individuals with. Because let's face it, there aren't that many gods who would prefer their holy symbol of office, a crozier, a staff, or a sceptre, to be used in the personal bludgeoning of an enemy, than for the clerics to leave the matter of whether these pellets will tear apart their enemy to the gods, to fate. Instead, casting them out and hoping that the gods will find it in their hearts to allow them to strike true. The agency is taken out of the hand of man and into the god's own will. And of course the skill of the slinger. And we don't even need to change anything about the kind of weird Catholic identity and aesthetic that many priests and clerics often do have. You know what I'm talking about, the ones in Hessian sacks with a tonsure on top of their head and a rope belt around them, or the ones dressed in white flowing robes with pope hats, or the ones wielding a book with a cross on the front. This is really quite common across fantasy, to be honest. But we don't have to change any of this. Bishops, croziers, or crooks, and also slings are both traditionally associated with shepherds and herdsmen, symbols of simplicity and of leading a flock. And we've all heard the tale of David, buoyed by his faith to strike true against the great warrior Goliath, right? In sum, then, a bizarre ahistorical extrapolation born from a Norman wall hanging embroidered by a collection of nuns, most likely, has kicked off an entire trend in modern fantasy whereby a certain type of character, more often than not, will use a specific, not very well suited style of weapon, where an alternative weapon that fulfills all of the criteria that the prior one is built to use is actually more practical as well as, in my opinion, being more sensible and more cool. Slinging sacred stones sounds sick, personally. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeonmaster. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.